Tere!
Good afternoon. So I'm back here to tell you about a group of finds, swords, found in Salme. And they were surprisingly many. Here you can see the picture of the burial of the boat, Salme boat, and you can see there are many items there. There were really many items, but the number of types was relatively small. Mostly we found the rivets. They were the biggest in number, more than 1,000, slightly more than 1,000. Next group was made up of gaming pieces, about 250 of them. Rather 350, the speaker corrects himself. And the next group of finds were arrowheads, around 50. At about 50. And then came the swords. And I'm going to tell you more about the swords. And then there were also shields, combs, and little bits and pieces, beads and things like that as well. But let's turn to the swords then. So these are the types of items that I have grouped here. So they can be dated to different periods. This applies both to the pieces of the shields. There are early ones dating back to the 7th century and even earlier, with a little low button here in the middle. And the main part is different kind of a shield, and then the gaming pieces are slightly earlier, and you cannot see here, but we should. I don't know why we can't see this, but there's also a sword, piece of a sword that goes back to the 6th century actually. And then the arrowheads and another interesting type like iron-made fibula that were not found in Estonia before Salme, although they have been found in Scandinavian countries and in Finland before. So they are really unique for Estonia. And the swords are two types. One edged and double-edged ones. In the Germanic language, langseaks. And the other type is the long single-edged sword. Only few of them have been found in Estonia before. And Marika says that she has found fragments elsewhere as well, so it was not possible to say what type they were and how long they really were, these swords. And this also applies to continental Estonia. Very few have been found of this type, but then fighting or battle knives have come out in quite big numbers of later dates. But these are also, these long seaks are of a problematic nature. Maybe we'll be discussing this later, but I think they are represented in all Scandinavian countries, in Norway, Denmark, on Bornholm Island, Gotland Island, but there are very few in continental Sweden. Only occasional items have been found of this type. But in Salme, they constitute of the swords. I'm going to show you the calculations later, but about 43 or 44 swords are of this type that have been found from the two ships, or that have been found from the two ships altogether first. So quite a number. So this is the calculation or summary, these are the Salme swords. They pretty much look the same. They have a long blade and their handle is also relatively long, and the measurements are here. The longest sword, the blade was 100 centimeters, so a meter long, had a blade, and the shortest was less than 50 centimeters. But most of the blades were between 58 to 69 centimeters. But again, when we look at the different types, there is also there are also different. But in case of Salme, this is one event, or I'm convinced, or rather, all facts show that Salme, the whole Salme, was happened at the same time, and consequently the items belong to the same time as well. So we have to accept the fact that despite the fact that typologically they might belong to different periods, but they are coming from one moment of time, just one moment of time, maybe a few weeks. And given the distance of time, 1300 years from now, then we can easily assume this. So this is the story with the single-edged swords. And technologically, they have been made also in pretty much the same way. The back part of the blade has been made of soft steel, low carbon content iron, but the cutting blade here in the front and the blade in the front has been made from stronger material, which makes the sword
okei. Aitäh. Ja et see teraslõhe sinna.
Adding the steel sheet to the front part was done in different ways, and you can even see regional differences as to the make of those swords, but this is how it was. So it is relatively simply made and sort of also of a simple man. But the interesting thing about Salme was that sometimes they were also grouped with a double-edged sword, which is a more complicated together. So the number of single-edged swords. I think I had the number there in my previous table. This is the summary about the single-edged swords and the distribution of them. This is not by different types, but how they have preserved. So we can see that we had 9 swords that were completely whole. Okay, we had whole and complete. The difference between whole and complete is whole means that it has not been cut, or maybe it has been bent, but it is still in one piece. And complete means that at the time of burial, in the rites there, it had been ruined in some way. Either it has been rolled up or cut into 3 pieces, or cut into pieces. But all the pieces are there, even if they are a little bit distant from each other, they still fit together nicely. Altogether, we had 11 of the complete ones, 9 of the whole ones, so altogether 20. In addition, we had 3 blades And as you can see, oh, not blades, sorry, it's tangs. And they do not... Blades mean the tip end of the swords, which tells us that the tangs and the 6 blades taken together, it shows us that we had at least 23 swords, plus we could combine a few others. So let's agree to the number that we have here. So this is how it is. So we looked at the measurements, I mentioned those already, and then we take a look at the first layer of the skeletons. And we can see here how the swords were distributed. Taking the skeleton A, on the right-hand side there seems to be a piece of a shield and also the sword, but actually they do not belong to this first skeleton A, but they are actually belonging to the body 17 that is below the A, and the one skeleton that also had the dog head underneath the elbow. So it could have been that the dog was placed on the shield and that was higher, but before they started burying the first layer here, then before that it was covered with sand in order to be able to bury the next layer, and the dog's tail was left out during the time. So it had been already placed there, but it was then buried, and and probably it was placed on a shield, the dog. So this is how it was. And the shield was also quite ruined already, and an edge had been turning upwards already, so that it wasn't a whole thing. And I'm not going to discuss shields today any longer, but at first I thought that the shields had been covering uniformly these bodies. Maybe this was the plan, but the shields had been broken and the edges were deformed, and you can see this from the picture as well, which shows that the wooden part of the shield must have been broken as well. So on the first layer here, in the first layer, you can see at least 2 double-edged swords. One of them is here near the skeleton. Here should be here. You can see a kind of a curvy thing between B and C. So this is actually an interesting sword. And the other sword is between D and E. On this, it's had a bronze hilt, and it is on the level of their hips. This is another interesting item. When I was introducing my presentation, I forgot to mention that double-edged swords. So in the first layer, there were only I mentioned that there were only one edge, a single-edged, but there were actually 2 double-edged swords as well. And then between E and F, there is nothing in between. There seems to be a trench between them. And this is the trench where the yellow cable was placed. And this was when the items actually started to be found. And there was also one piece that also fit together with a piece of the first ship. And the skeletons here seem to be intact, except for G. But this one also has 2 double-edged and 1 single-edged sword as well. So they did not come out when the yellow cable was dug. So they could either belong to E or F. So one of them is the longest sword. Altogether 117 centimeters with the blade and the hilt. And more about the single-edged swords, their hilts also varied up to 20 centimeters. So this could have been used as a two-hand weapon and could give you a really bad punch. Let's look now at the double-edged swords. I have this table here, and you can see that the picture is quite different here. Namely, all double-edged swords, every single one of them had been broken to pieces. So we didn't have one single sword that was completely intact. And we could figure out the number only by many of them did not have blades, even if everything was properly buried. But for some reason, during burial, they hadn't placed the swords there as well. Maybe this was done on purpose or was lost for some reason. That is why I took as a basis for calculating the number, I took the hilts and the bronze hilts, and they were really luxurious and beautiful. There were 6 of them, 6 bronze hilt swords. Then another interesting type was that had a silver hilt as well, so it wouldn't fit properly into this context, but it existed. And then we had 3 or 4 swords. So we had 6 of the previous ones, then we had 3 of the other ones, and one hush sword, the previous one, and then another one which makes altogether 10. And then we have the swords that only have the button of the hilt left. They have had no metal hilt at all. Probably the hilt was made of wood or some other organic material that has gone lost. Then in the case of 2 double-edged swords, many of them have been broken. But before breaking, they have also been filed, so that or cut even, and then from that precise place they have been broken. And some of the pieces have also hilts or pieces of hilt left. But quite a number of swords have been bent together U-shape. And one of them has been also bent together in such a way that the damask steel central part has avoided its breaking, but the cutting blades have actually broken. We can see this on the photo here. Here's the technique of how they were made. We have found today two types of swords. Looking at the bottom one first, this is a more widespread sword, which is made so that in the middle there are 3 damask steel pieces, and then there are 3 iron bars in it as well. So this is how they make it. So the softer material and the harder material is put together and turned and twisted. But then there are also those where there are two bars in the core of the sword, and this one is the one that did not break altogether, but only the steel parts have ripped off or have been. So this was a sword that had in the center an elastic core. So this central part gave elasticity to the sword, and the rest of the parts are very hard steel that made it very sharp and strong. I don't know whether it can cut a silk ribbon from the air with one strike, but it could have a Gillette sharpness. Well, I'm probably exaggerating here, but it is technically possible. And the other type is up here. No, there must be a mistake. Okay. In the upper. Let me show you from here. There's a kind of an error. So in the middle part, you can see the central part made up of two pieces, and on top of that there are two blades made of steel. It's like a form in which you can make them, and these were kept when the when the sword was made. It looked like the bottom one. You couldn't distinguish it from the bottom one, but it is different in the inside. I've got an error here because the upper scheme should have a lighter row here as well, but for some reason it isn't visible here. So this middle sword was not so high quality. So they added some steel plates to this. So the bottom one has a core of stronger steel in between, but the other one has only plates added to this of the same material, which actually did not add anything to the quality, really. It's like, remember, we had original jeans from abroad, and then we had all sorts of funny local-made jeans as well. And let me give you an example about the Estonian epic character Kalevipoeg. He went to see a blacksmith of Finland, and at first he was given all sorts of bad quality swords, and finally he got the real thing. So I think the bottom one was the one that was also something that Kalevipoeg could have used. So we have here one hilt that we looked at it already, and these are different types of salme, and specialists have to come together and discuss this, how to classify them. This could be type G, for example, and the blade was also made out of proper steel material, and time-wise it also fits in properly. And here's another thing, another sword. There were differences in the construction of the blade. In some cases the tang comes at a right angle, and in some cases it's slanted. That means that they may have hilts of wood. Here we should have the Western Finnish type of sword. I am taking the classification according to Salme. He wrote a book about the Viking swords in 1939. Here is a Liina, Mandres or Ragnar's sword. When in 2012 there were some excavations there by him, and this is when it was found. But why was it called Liina's sword? Because it was in her area where she was digging, and no one really believed that this came out as well. Because when we were digging here, when someone said, "Oh, maybe there is another sword," and no one reacted, "Oh, another sword, we have so many," and they just didn't even look up and continued digging. And this was the same case here. What else can you find? We might find another sword, but it took quite a while, and we had many attempts, and a lot of time was spent on digging there, and finally it started crawling out, and finally you can see it was underneath the yellow cable. And the other interesting thing here was that it is a high quality sword, but after finding they wanted to bend it back so that it is a straight form, but it was actually bent together originally, and the tip was broken away, but it was also found. This is another West Finnish type of sword. And here we can see the sword. This is why I put this photo here. So this sword could belong to one of these guys, because the other ones had swords already, but this could belong to them as well. But this is an assumption really on how someone wants to see how they are distributed between the skeletons. Here's another. There are different types of swords here. This was from the first ship, another Western Finnish hilt, and as we could see, the blades were very big or massive. And the thing that wasn't so good in quality that I showed you, so this also comes from the first ship, and it is a considerably lighter sword. And here you can see the U shape, how it was bent together. Here's a great sword that came out of skeleton G, whose face was cut badly. So he had this fancy bronze hilted sword, and the bronze hilt has also a cross on it, and it is covered with some silver. Oh, and this is the same thing, I forgot. So at the beginning we thought this was a special type of a sword, but it seems to be also of Western Finnish type and has just lost a bit of it. Here's another Western Finnish one, and here's a very fancy sword. You can see bronze and gold even here, and the button on the hilt one was really beautiful, and this was also analyzed. As you can see, there are some empty areas here, and this used to have garnets that came from Ceylon, and this was also analyzed, and the result was found as such. And when the area from where the stones are missing, when the rest of the area here has been gilded, but the places where the stones were, they were filled with silver. So there was a kind of a silver layer in the bottom there, which made the sword to glitter more. So it is known that such methods were used, although the swords were gilded, because we also found some quicksilver there as well. It could have been enough, but for some reason it was necessary to add a silver sheet there as well. So maybe this was how it was to be done. We don't know. And then the blade of the same sword is here. This is really nice as well. The central part is again stronger, and here's the blades, cutting blades, and the unique thing in the middle is a gilded wire or layer. This is where you get the pattern, and this is really interesting. You can see there are some things facing each other, whether they were some kind of figures, what things were there, you can only imagine. And there were quite nice ornaments there. So it's difficult to say what they are, but they are illustrating the sword, and they must have had a meaning for the owner. And this is obviously a very expensive sword, and it belonged to one of the brothers whose grandchild was also the body L was probably the eldest, and his grandchild was I. Maybe there was a whole family that lost their lives there, that they added this more than 100-year-old very fancy sword to the grave. This probably was taken down by centuries, by generations. So it must have been a nobleman's family. And when we look at this L, the king or the chief, I didn't name him a king. It is a later thing. It could have been the focal point of the whole person of the burial. And he had a gaming piece. Or rather, he was given this very fancy sword. Maybe it was others had to take an oath on the basis of this sword. So what have we got here? This is probably also something. And here's different types of sword hilts of Salme. A small burial, but so much interesting stuff in there. And when we look at the different types, they also belong to different eras. So the material is really interesting. And then the last sword, and the Swedes should probably know the left-hand side. I didn't add the name, but it is a famous Ultuna sword. And the ornament is really looks like the one that we had in Salme. So at least one school of masters might have created this, if not the same master. And the grip note or the grip block came out as well, came out of the concrete. And I put some photos here as well. You can see the layer of concrete here. And this is where the digging was carried out. We had spades and shovels and spoons even. And this is the dog to prove what I've just said and tells you thank you. And about the previous photo you saw here, I want to remind you that it's the custom of archaeologists and the special nature of archaeology, that archaeology is based on the work of children, students and women. We exploit them ruthlessly. Thank you for your attention.
aitäh. Kas
Thank you very much. Are there questions on the swords you would like to ask, Jüri?
does anybody have questions regarding swords? They want to ask Jüri.
Maybe you, John, comments about this Langseax. Langseaxes in Middle Sweden.
Yeah, long saxes in Middle Sweden is a big problem. As you said, they are found on Bornholm and they are found on Gotland, yes, and in Norway in some degree. And that's where Anne Nørgaard Jørgensen published them, the nice ones. And
in Finland, a lot of...
Yeah, and in Finland, of course. Yes, right. But the problem with Middle Sweden is that all the boat graves from this period are plundered in our boat graves. And it's not a practice in the cremation burials to bury langsaxes. So that's what I'm convinced that they were frequently used, but we don't find them in the graves. We find a few up in Norrland, in northernmost Sweden. There are a few. There are more than in Middle Sweden. So Middle Sweden is surrounded by langsaxes. So I think they were used there as well.